to Free to Disagree's Communal Sense podcast. My name is Amanda MacDonald. This is Ray Reyes.
Hola.
And today we're going to talk about the Yemeni Civil War and the proxy wars that are occurring between Iran, and Saudi Arabia.
Like Iraq? It's like, where are you going? Where are you going with this? We're 2003?
Okay, so to give a little bit of background, in 1979, Iran had a revolution in which they kind of casted out their current, at that time, kind of executive and instituted another. When they did this, they also kind of conceptualized the idea that asymmetric warfare was a better avenue of approach than perhaps their, at that time, current direct approach between Iraq and Iran, in which Iran lost something like 1 million Iranian soldiers and gained very little actual geographical ground. So I want to talk a little bit about the current state between Saudi Arabia and Iran and kind of how that's going to be implicated against the United States as we send soldiers over there. So I wanted to get Ray's point of view basically on on what the kind of geopolitical implications would be in the event that the United States is sending and continues to send United States soldiers in Saudi Arabia's stead.
I mean, wow. My opinion on it. I think we discussed a lot before this pod.
Yeah, for sure.
This discussion.
Too much.
Too much. We started talking about Pakistan, Russia, China.
Yeah.
No, but mine is a simple view to probably me and you, because we know what hegemony and the difference between multipolarity, bipolarity, unipolarity means, or the implications of that with the stabilized international arena. However, I don't think many people do. Like my stance, and I wrote down notes here, was because I have trouble memorizing exactly what I want to say. So I just wrote down notes so I know exactly what I want to say, and I say exactly what I want to say. But my opinion on sending troops to Saudi Arabia, just to put it simple, is a positive one. I think we should be sending troops to Saudi Arabia, because it's essentially to protect hegemony. And of course, I think we've already discussed that that goes further into just hegemony.
Right.
But keeping hegemony, essentially does bring us all back. It reels in the rails of going all over the place to actually national security, because you want to stabilize the international arena, because let's be real, we're not in 1776 anymore, where isolationism is even going to have a hint of working. Now we want to be, and I hate saying this word, and that's why I use internationalism instead, but we do want to align more with globalism. Globalism, unlike your far right wingers, and this is why I get called a rhino or a neocon all the time. Globalism is a good thing to keep international stability, and in turn keeps national security. And as I mentioned in my notes here, I think that's exactly what we're trying to do, whether it's implicit or explicit interest that we have in Saudi Arabia or wherever it is in that region. I think it's important we send troops to support Saudi Arabia, because just like Saudi Arabia and Iran had that single layer of a or still have that single layer of a Cold War going on, the fact that we support Saudi Arabia in every aspect, or most aspects in their fight in the Middle East, I do think that we do have, like you were saying, a second layer of that Cold War going on in the Middle East. Back in those days, as you were explaining the history, I think Iran and Saudi Arabia definitely have, or still have as well, that Cold War going on. It's not Saudi Arabia versus Iran, even though you can actually legitimately argue that.
Right.
But like you could have legitimately argued in the Cold War with the U.S. and Soviet Russia. But we didn't directly declare war with each other, as Iran and Saudi Arabia aren't doing the same thing. Instead, they're using proxy wars and proxy nations groups, if you will, to fight those wars. But I do believe a lot of it does stem from oil. Of course it does. And simply saying oil, of course it does. And simply saying oil will scare off a lot of Americans, left and right wingers. And this is why I hate a lot of my fellow right wingers. That they're like, well, it's just
God. Hate. It's such a strong word.
Okay, hate's a strong word, but you know what I mean by that.
Yeah.
I'm just using that.
You find
loose.
yourself in disagreement.
There you go. I'm using that hate loosely, if you will. But I do think whenever I tell them, yeah, it's fighting for oil, what's the big deal? I like to say that just to actually throw that out there and actually seem like the evil guy that I just want oil and money. However,
how dare you?
How dare I just want to fight for oil, you know? But it's not that simple. It goes back to playing towards the hegemony. We want to remain in that position to keep the international arena, quote unquote, stable. Because in reality, when you had multipolarity, that essentially caused World War I and World War II. When you had bipolarity, obviously Soviet Russia and the U.S., there was relatively zero wars with nation versus nation. It was like we were talking about proxy wars. And now after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, well, you can argue it was 1989, but obviously the official timeline was 1991.
Yeah. When the Soviet Union collapsed.
Right. You can argue that there hasn't been more than one single power in the international arena. So obviously it's us, the United States of America. So obviously whether they have whatever problems they have in the Middle East and the allies that we have there, if you want to go with the UAE and Saudi Arabia, they are going to look to the U.S. for assistance, for aid.
Right.
So we need to, whether it's in our direct or indirect interest, to actually intervene there to maintain that hegemony, to essentially maintain international order, to essentially maintain national security, because again, we're not in 1776 anymore. Our geographical location is not going to save us. I hope all that makes sense.
So let's put in a little bit of context, right? So Yemen initially was kind of separated between the northwest and the southeasternmost of the region. A compact was made in which it unified Yemen, and since then, on the Arabian Peninsula, we have Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel, and Syria, and Iraq, and Iran, right? And they're all kind of in the same space. The only thing that separates Saudi Arabia and Iran is the Strait of Hormuz. And the Strait of Hormuz is a naval access point from which Saudi Arabian oil is exported to the rest of the world, as well as Iranian oil is exported to the rest of the world. And this is important because just within the last 3.5 weeks to 4 weeks, it was suggested by President Trump that Iran was responsible for targeting Saudi Arabian oil refineries, which was Saudi Aramco. And Saudi Aramco was actually scheduled for an IPO, which is like an international public offering, right, about how much these stocks are going to trade for with Saudi Arabian oil. And that was scheduled for, I think, November. And so the Houthis, which are a group in the northwestern region of Yemen, just on the border of Saudi Arabia. This group claimed, claimed some kind of credit for the attack against Saudi Arabian oil refineries. But the United States, the UK, Germany, France, they all agreed that it was probably Iran who did this, mostly because of the understanding that Iran operates better using asymmetrical power proxies and proxy war as opposed to direct war with other nations. The last time that Iran was in a direct war was when it was in a direct war with Iraq, in which neither state got significant gains, and the Iranian military ended up losing over 1 million people. Yeah, so since then,
I think Iraq got some gains on that, except again, with the backing of Saudi Arabia, that quote unquote wall actually leaned more towards Iraq. But yeah, essentially they didn't really
Right,
gain
and at that
much.
time, Saudi Arabia actually was funneling funds to Iraq, and it
Yes.
wasn't until the 2001 September 11 attacks that the United States figured out that we had a bunch of Saudi nationals that were the hijackers of the planes in the 2011 attack or the 2001 attacks, and then we kind of went in and destabilized Iraq and their weapons of mass destruction. And I think that that was generally bad for the Middle East in that it separated the only territory between Saudi Arabia and Iran and kind of made it a destabilized power vacuum in which any terrorist organization could pretty much prop itself up. And this is where Al-Qaeda kind of comes into play. So in Yemen, we have Al-Qaeda, the Daesh, I think it's called the Daesh.
Daesh.
The Daesh.
D-A-E-S-H.
Yeah, D-A-E-S-H.
Daesh.
So it was Al-Qaeda, the Daesh, and the Houthis, who are all trying to pretty much push forward on the Saudi Arabian peninsula and make some territorial gains. And this is relatively for the fact that the Houthis believed that there was no, how do you say, that the coalition that was otherwise made would destabilize the Houthi interest in the region, which essentially is to kind of dethrone Salih, who is now dead. The Houthis killed him, I think, in 2000, maybe 2015, I think.
Might have been earlier.
But the Houthis have since taken Sana'a, and Sana'a is the primary city in Yemen, and the executive from the Yemen government, the Yemeni government, fled to Saudi Arabia. And in fleeing to Saudi Arabia, he then got with the United States because we have a treaty with Saudi Arabia from the 1940s that says, hey, if there's any threat to the oil supply for the international market, we're going to go ahead and we're going to intervene. So the United States is naturally allied with Saudi Arabia in that sense from the pretext of the treaty from the 1940s. But what ends up happening is now we have Israel, which is in the upper northwest territory of Saudi Arabia, just outside of Syria. And then we have the United Arab Emirates, which are in the southeast region, Saudi Arabia itself, and the United States. Of these powers that are called the kind of Saudi coalition in the area, the Saudi Arabians are actually the weakest because of where their oil refinery is and because of its proximity to the Strait of Hormuz. And Iran, on the other hand, has its own asymmetrical proxy between Syria, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iran itself. Right, so we kind of find ourselves in this position where Yemen is kind of being fought over by a bunch of different international powers, but in which nobody is actually claiming war upon each other. So that is our first degree of the proxy Cold War in the Middle East between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And if you level that up to maybe a second degree of kind of a Cold War proxy, then you have the United States backing Saudi Arabia, and in Iran, Turkey and Russia via the OPEC are kind of together in their own coalition in which they're allowing for this stuff to kind of persist. So recently the Houthis have claimed that they captured over 1,000 Saudi Arabian soldiers, killed 500, but they haven't actually released any kind of true evidence to support this. And like Ray was saying, the United States is only participating because of the hegemonic activity by the United States to kind of assert our power and say, okay, we're the most powerful in the world, we're the most powerful in the region, and so to make sure that we maintain this idea and that Russia maybe, as the second degree of proxy, is not going to be the challenging power, that the United States is going to take control of the situation. And I think that this kind of puts us in a precarious position because we have the United States that can't say that maybe Iran didn't do this, right? We can't we can't just allow the Arabian Peninsula to kind of just fall into complete ruin, although it is an interest of the United States to ensure that there is not one overarching authority in the Middle East.
It's debatable.
It's debatable, right? But the United States' interest in this point has everything to do with energy, especially with the oncoming debates of climate change that we've seen over recent weeks with Greta Thunberg.
Oh my God, don't even get me started on that. Oh.
And just with the idea of oil circulation throughout the entire international community. So oil prices have risen something like from $68 per barrel to like $72 per barrel. The attack on the Saudi Arabia Aramco.
Mm-hmm.
I said that right earlier. Aramco, that destabilized oil prices. It affected 5% of our, and I say our, which is weird that I'm saying that, but the Saudi Arabian oil export, basically.
You
and Saudi Arabia is...
considering the fact that it really implicates and impacts the entire world.
Right, the world oil economy, the world oil
Right, so
market.
we're included in that, so that's fair.
Right.
Yeah.
So we kind of find ourselves in this position of, okay, are we going to side with the Saudi Arabian coalition and kind of depress the Houthis and restabilize the energy infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, or are we going to move into a different space in which we do nothing at all, thus undermining the United States hegemony in the region and allowing Iran, Russia, and Turkey to kind of take over whatever's going to happen? And there's also a religious component to this because the Saudi Arabians are relatively Sunnis. Muslims, while the Iranians are Shiites. And
Shiites, actually.
It puts us
Shiites,
in a position.
they back to Shias, which is so whatever.
It's so weird. It puts us in a position in which the United States is kind of in a position, and Donald Trump included, where if we send soldiers here, is it really to maintain just hegemony, like Ray says, or is it to ensure that no one has any overarching stability in the Middle East?
Let me just to intervene on that part.
No, yeah, please.
I say it's to maintain hegemony and to maintain the quote unquote Cold War in the Middle East, only because you have to keep in mind as to what type of aid he's sending, and what he's
he being Donald Trump.
The administration.
Okay.
We can't really just say it's Donald Trump because I don't think he's pulling the strings,
I
obviously.
see what you're saying.
But you got to keep in mind he's sending 200 troops. Oh, keep that in mind, first of all. The type of aid he's sending is air defense systems and radar and training the Saudis, because essentially what they're trying to say is they want to prop up the Saudi Arabia to where they can defend themselves.
Right.
And air defense systems and radar, the 200 troops. Right. So
because Saudi Arabia is the weakest of this coalition between Israel and
using
the UAE
all that of the type of aid they're sending and the 200 troops, to me anyway, it says that those 200 troops are just there to fulfill those needs. Air defense systems, which is they're essentially using the Patriot missile systems, and radar. So 200 troops is really nothing.
Not in the American context.
Not in the American context. So I think that's the 200 troops, which is where he was saying in that one tweet where he's not going to commit to say Iran is fully responsible for this, but he's not bringing it off the table. Though I think,
well, if Germany, France,
right, I think it was Germany and the UK said it was. If they all
say Iran is responsible, then the United States has some kind of justification to go in and say, "Hey, Iran is responsible."
Perhaps, but I think if he believed that was solid justification, I think that entire council, especially the DOD, would advise him to send more than 200 troops, because I think those 200 troops are just there to fulfill the needs of air defense, radar, and training up the Saudis. So right now, I think he's playing more of all right, let's see what happens, and we're just going to send these troops to fulfill those needs.
Right, because he doesn't want to go ahead and just declare war on Iran.
Right, and I don't think that will ever happen as far as declaring war against Iran as a country, which we can go on to that discussion we had earlier as to where he was trying to, or it wasn't him, but the administration was trying to proclaim the Iranian military as a terrorist organization. However, that would take us down a whole other road.
Well, it even puts us down a different road now, right? Because the Houthis are saying, hey, we've killed over 500 Saudi Arabians, and by the way, we captured a battalion of Saudi Arabians.
Which is probably not true, but...
We only think it's not true, right, because we're the West and they haven't really put out anything. But
Right,
a counterpoint to that would be, okay, let's say that the Houthis did seize a battalion of soldiers from Saudi Arabian government.
That's even more than a battalion, though.
It's more than a battalion.
Because it was 2,000.
Sure.
It wasn't 1,000. I think I read 2,000. Even 2,000 is like, my God.
Well, even still, let's say that they did. Why would they put out some kind of video to show this is the geographical location of all 2,000 troops when the American CIA or the UK CIA or anybody could just go ahead and do
the UK CIA?
Yeah. Whatever. You know what I meant.
Was it MI6 or
yeah,
MI5?
MI6. But these people can do kind of like a geographical analysis of
and find
the
that.
region and
Right.
figure out exactly, within 10 degrees of where exactly you are on the world
Because holding
map.
2,000 troops, that's got to be a large. It's come
That's a
on.
lot.
now.
And the question is, does the Houthi military or the Houthi militia have the means to do this? Because up until the attacks on Saudi Arabia's oil refinery, it wasn't assumed that they had. What was assumed was that the Houthis kind of had this crude weapons mechanism in their military that wouldn't allow for such precision in their strikes. But because they've claimed the attacks on Aramco, it's kind of like maybe they do. And if they do, and they've taken over 2,000 soldiers, does that mean that Trump now
Did you
is
read the
going
conspiracy
to be,
theories on those?
I didn't. But does that mean that Trump now is going to be responsible for more than just 200 troops? Are we going to end up sending 2 battalions over to rescue the 1 battalion of Saudi Arabian soldiers that has been captured or supposedly captured?
That
and
fits.
that puts us in a geopolitical position, right? A big one, I think.
That actually, and I hate this. I'm going to say this just
your
for
point.
Well, no, I'm going to say this to justify these, to at least entertain the conspiracy theorists. They were saying that because we didn't believe the Houthis had capability to be so precise in their attacks. I read this morning that a lot of the conspiracy theorists were saying that maybe Israel was behind these attacks.
And that the weapons were United States made. That's true. That's a fact.
And that they planted that, or at least wanted that, so that they could force Trump to send more than 200 troops. And that's why I was like laughing at that. And I'm like, oh, well, that kind of like.
And that's something to think about too, right? Because the Saudi Arabian government, what do they have on their borders? Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas. Right? If they want to make sure that the United States has nothing but has no choice but to bring more soldiers to the Middle East, that is just the quicker way in which they can be deployed to Israel. I think that's something to think about if you're talking to be a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's something to think about, or at least entertain. At least, like I like to do, is entertain. It's entertaining. A conspiracy theorist is entertaining, but however, it's a lot of logical thinking. Rational is a different story,
right?
But
so true.
But then again, you would have to assume people are rational, and that's a whole different philosophical conversation.
Are we controlled by our emotions and have no free will?
Or we're going to go Hobbesian or Lockean view? Or
yeah, are we Nietzscheans? Who knows?
But that's a whole different conversation. But still, I think it is very interesting to see where this ends up. But I still think that the U.S. has a place in this conflict as far as sending aid to any ally, whether it's ours directly or the traditional allies, if you will, UK, Germany, France, even though Germany is not a traditional ally, but you know what I mean, and stuff like that. But
well, even speaking of aid, right? If this is the greatest humanitarian crisis since 2015, if this humanitarian crisis in Yemen parallels at all to the Palestinian humanitarian crisis that's happening in the Levant and the Gaza Strip, then does the United States have some kind of international responsibility from which it is to, some kind of obligation from which it is to respond to this humanitarian crisis? And if that is the case, what do we do? Because Saleh is in, he is the how do you say,
former?
Well, I don't want to say former, right? Because it's not really former. So he is the actual Yemeni government executive, and he has fled to Israel or to Saudi Arabia.
That's what I said former.
And in Saudi Arabia, the MBS and Saleh are kind of like conspiring together in this coalition to try to oppress the Houthi rebellion that's happening in Yemen. But if it's the Yemenis people who are having the issue with the humanitarian crisis, at what point is it the United States' responsibility to not send soldiers but to send humanitarian aid to Yemen?
Can you
and
not do
we
both?
Well, hold on. If we don't send humanitarian aid to Yemen, which we haven't yet, then are we complicit in Yemeni's genocide? Because there are people on the left who are saying some things like talking about Trump impeachment, for example. You know, the Democrats want to impeach Donald Trump because of his dealings with Ukraine and asking kind of what's going on with Joe Biden and asking the Ukrainian government to investigate Joe Biden and Joe Biden's son. But let's say, for example, that they did it on a different degree, on a different avenue of approach, in which they said, actually, we want to impeach Donald Trump because Donald Trump is complicit in Yemeni's genocide by not sending humanitarian aid.
Have they actually used that argument, though?
I have heard this argument on various left-leaning political podcasts, such as David Pakman or the Kyle Kaczynski.
I know what it is. I never heard of this stuff, though.
But these two guys are kind of saying things like, look, we don't have a problem with Trump talking to Ukraine. If the Democrats want to go ahead and narrow their avenue of approach from which to impeach Donald Trump and say that it's only Ukraine, that's a bad move. A better move would be to say that he's complicit in Yemeni's genocide. And that kind of, if you're talking about the hegemony, the overarching political authority of the United States in the international system, you have to
perhaps, but the Yemenis
have to face that argument and say something like, "Okay, is this the United States' hegemonic problem that we have to respond, or is it not?"
Yes and no, considering the fact that the problem in Yemen even arose way before he was even elected president. It started
it
with
arose in 2015. That's true.
Well, no, with the Arab Spring in 2011 to begin with. That's when it all started.
That's even more true.
So you can't explicitly put that all on Donald Trump.
We'll say that he's only sending troops and he's not sending aid.
Does he have to, though? And I guess that's where the argument
question.
Is. Right.
If he doesn't send aid, is he complicit in genocide? That's the question.
Right, but even if you can answer back at like I just asked, does he have to? That itself, that question itself to the question you just posed, even tells you no, it's not or it's not enough to even consider impeachment, because there is an argument for both sides. To even argue that he should be sending aid to Yemen or anything, considering the fact that there's both sides of that of the enemies and allies going at it in Yemen or outside of Yemen, in Saudi Arabia in Iran, and sending aid is not something. Sending aid to either of those regions is not something you can just decide on right there and then. There's implications you need to hash out first, like we were discussing before the podcast. It's like, well, who's going where, why are we there?
Yeah, if we send aid to the Yemeni people, are we actually also sending aid to the Houthis?
Right.
It's a good question.
So it's there's a lot of implications of where this aid's going, who are we actually aiding, and whether or not our allies are even behind this quote unquote need, which I think that they are, but there's just so much to hash out there to even say that what do you call it, impeachment is justified through this.
Well, it seems to me that because it seems like we're kind of shifting gears now to impeachment a little bit, but it seems to me that those people who are on the ideological left, the hard left, the left-wingers that kind of perceive all of the American political institution as like corrupt for the time being.
Right.
Those individuals are saying, hey, the Yemeni crisis is a crisis in which Donald Trump is complicit in genocide. And if we have a president who is complicit in genocide, these are definitely high crimes and misdemeanors. This is possibly treason because we're supposed to be allied with the Saudi Arabian government, and we're supposed to ensure that by our hegemony that we are providing for the humanitarian crises of the world. And it's kind of like, do they have a point there? Because I think that the argument could be made that they definitely do.
Sure,
right?
they do, if that's true.
And I don't think that the impeachment process is going to go this way, obviously, because the Democrats have already exclaimed that they have narrowed the scope to the Ukrainian incident, which is a mistake on the Democratic part if they want to go ahead and have an actual impeachment, right? But if we're talking about Yemen, it puts us into this awkward position as the hegemonic power. Like, do we have, like Machiavelli would say, right? Do we have an obligation to foreign powers to provide for them when they cannot provide for themselves?
I think we do.
Is that the nature of being the hegemonic power, or are we actually a bipolar power in which we should really just leave that question to Russia, who will not provide for it?
I think we have an obligation to provide that aid if all that stems to be 100% accurate. If there is even
like a sliver.
I was trying to think of the word, like a sliver of chance that it's not, then I don't think we have a full obligation to even get in there and assist Yemen in that, or explicit in that way as far as humanitarian aid. Should we be concerned about that? Of course.
Well, it's the greatest humanitarian crisis in the world,
right? Should we be concerned?
As a hegemonic
of course,
power, we should definitely be concerned with that.
But we can't just jump right in there and start that aid if we don't know exactly what it is we're getting into.
We know for a fact that we have something between 12 and 24 million people in Yemen that are on the brink of starvation.
Right, yeah. I mean, but yeah, no, you're right. Yeah,
so we know it's a humanitarian crisis.
And a lot of the weapons that were dropped there to cause that was from Saudi Arabia, and a lot of
we financed.
And I was gonna say a lot of the financial backings was from us, but a lot of those.
If we destroy something, are we going to build it up?
But when? That's the thing. When do
What do you mean when? Like,
do we do it now?
Do you account when as 12 million people have died of starvation, or 24 million people have died from starvation? But that's the thing.
Do you judge it based off deaths? Or do you judge
How
it?
else would you judge it?
You would judge
deaths?
it based on what exactly is the power structure at that point. Then, because if you start going in now, then who are you actually helping?
I mean, it's a fair question, right? Because we were talking about earlier how the UAE is kind of like this wild card.
Right, yeah.
They're saying they're part of the United States coalition with Saudi Arabia and with Israel, but then when they're actually on the ground and they're committing themselves to military tactic, what they're doing is they're siding with southern separatists in Yemen, which would kind of put them in the position in which they want to ensure that the Yemenis government is divided between North and South. And I think that might have something more to do with United Arab Emirates wanting some kind of territorial gain for their own kind of military application in Yemen to suppress Al Qaeda.
Yeah, because if you think about it, you look at that picture of who's in that area, who's even helping who. It's Iran with the Houthis, of course. Then you've got the southern separatists, who of course are, like we were saying, they have a common enemy in Saudi Arabia. However, they also have an ideological tension between everyone else. So they align a lot with the Houthis and Iran only because they have a common enemy. However, you've got all these other guys over here who are just not only politically battling each other, they do have that tension with the Houthis and Iran. So it's all just a
proxy Cold War.
It's a melting pot of what in the hell is going on. And if we send aid now, it's like that question: who are we helping? Are we actually helping who we want to help?
Are the Houthis going to somehow gain control of that? Are we actually going to send the aid to Saudi Arabia and hope that they disseminate it to Yemen instead of buying more weapons?
Right.
But at the same time, like, who are they buying weapons from, right? They're buying them from the United States.
Correct.
So it's like, do we have some kind of ideological interest in the Yemen Civil War continuing because we're selling weapons to them?
Right. No.
Right? So it's kind of like, okay, are we going to give money to Saudi Arabia? Are we going to give money to Yemen? And when we give money to Yemen, do we give them to the Houthis or do we give them to the the government's elite.
No, that's a good
Who is in Saudi Arabia.
And that's a good question. I think if you look at the bigger picture, or if we're talking about the Cold War and the layers upon layers of Cold War entities, I think what we're playing right now, or even not just us, but Russia even, we're aiding obviously Saudi Arabia, and Russia implicitly is aiding Iran because they have to. So right now
you got like alpha powers being the United States and Russia, and then the beta powers being Saudi Arabia and Iran. Yeah.
And I think what we're doing right now, both Russia and the U.S. is aiding Saudi and Iran, and trying to see who gains more ground, theoretically and physically at the same time. That way, it becomes clearer whether it's in the near future or further down long term.
Well, does it really need to be like so physical?
Well, what I'm talking about is when you gain more ground, you can actually see where the aid is going. So I think both sides are trying to figure out, well, who's going to gain more ground and who's where after that, as to if we do send humanitarian aid, we at least know more as to where that's going, rather than sending it right now where it's all just everywhere.
I mean, I feel like it would be relatively easy to say, like, that you don't really need territorial gains to go ahead and say who is going to have kind of like...
Well, maybe not territorial gains, but at least more of let's look at a graph, per se, of just who controls what, whether it's money, whether it's resources or land.
It would have to be the energy infrastructure. That would have to be the route
So
from
who
which
gains
you measure.
more ground there? To where if we start sending aid, we at least know where it's going, rather than where it is right now. To what we were saying, is it going to the Houthis or the Southern Separatists? More often is where we confuse where it ends up in, or is it really going to our allies in Saudi Arabia so that they can fight off whatever you want to align with? And so I think it's just really confusing in the Middle East, how it's always been. Even in Syria, it's been confusing.
Yeah, it's been similarly confusing in Syria for sure. And I just find myself in this position in which I'm kind of trying to like figure out if we're looking at the current state of everything, right? We're going to say that the Houthis went ahead. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt, and let's say that they captured 1,000 Saudi Arabian soldiers and killed 500 of them. And let's say on top of that the United States, the UK, France, and Germany are all correct in their assessment that Iran is responsible for the oil attacks against Aramco. And if that's the case, it's kind of like, what would the overarching motivation be for the attack on the oil infrastructure of Saudi Arabia? And if I'm Iran, that reason is clear, right? So the United States has put various types of economic sanctions on Iran, virtually crippling their energy economy, not really allowing them to export too much, causing some contention in the Strait of Hormuz, in which we're sinking submarines or we're sinking other oil ships that are meant to be for export. And it's kind of like, if I was Iran and I was facing economic sanctions, I would definitely spend the money to expel the weaponry to destabilize the Saudi Arabian oil infrastructure so that people would be forced to come to me through the Strait of Hormuz.
Or take over a bunch of Bitcoin mines,
instead of theirs.
which they have.
Yeah, the Bitcoin thing. Yeah. That's interesting.
But that's a different story. But I mean, it's not a different story. It's part of the story, but it's a different avenue of approach to any conversation. It's that they have taken over Bitcoin mining systems. Iran has, and that's also.
And if I was Iran, I would too, right? If my economy is crippling and my currency is even further falling down the drain, then I'm going to turn to a different type of currency to invest my infrastructure in.
Right? Yeah.
One that's unregulated, in which the United States is heavily invested, and in which somebody else is heavily invested, that would allow for me to be able to go ahead and rebuild my economy and my energy infrastructure economy on that.
What I don't know is how much the United States intelligence agencies have actually combated that. I don't know.
I'm sure that they haven't.
I'm sure that they've at least looked into it. What they've done, what they've done towards it, I don't know. Obviously, they're probably. I mean, obviously, we don't know what the heck they're doing.
Right.
But
not 100%. Not until 30 years from now.
Right. When the CIA releases their unclassified
information.
information.
Thanks for declassifying all that information.
Which is usually 20 to 30 years from the fact that
appreciate
that
the
it's
destabilization.
Yeah,
CIA.
yeah.
Appreciate.
But either or, the Bitcoin thing is it's fairly interesting. I'm not too deep into the Bitcoin to know exactly how everything works. I do know it works for the through the mining systems, and one of the reasons a lot of the mining systems have gone to Iran is because what do you call it? Electricity there is so cheap. So obviously, to run a Bitcoin mining system is obviously very efficient.
Which is interesting, right? Because we read that article that was like something like 2,000 mining computers for Bitcoin were seized by Tehran.
It was about a little over 1,000.
Even little over 1,000. That's like what, half of the market of Bitcoin right now that's mining stuff, and it's kind of like, holy crap! If I was Tehran, I would do that too. Yeah. I would totally do that.
Maybe a little over half is an exaggeration, but I know but I know what you mean. Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot.
It's a good amount. Yeah, for sure.
But even then, the whole situation with the Middle East and the Cold War in the Middle East, it's a lot more than a surface issue. And when I was telling you that the American society is so detached from reality that they blame everything on Trump, but they don't know exactly the implications of any decisions being made. That it stresses me out,
unintended consequences.
And it stresses me out, and it just infuriates me at the same time that it's hard to explain every single detail. And they're like, "Oh, you think Trump is that smart?" I'm like, "I'm not saying Trump is that smart."
No, it has nothing to do with him. Like,
right, exactly.
Neither one of us are huge Trump supporters.
No,
okay?
I didn't vote for the guy.
Yeah, I didn't vote for Trump either. We don't really like Trump over here, but that doesn't mean that we are completely unsympathetic to the political reality from which he lives right now.
And the implications of any decision he makes, especially what we're discussing right now. If let's say, oh, well, there's people dying right now, which is why I asked you, are deaths the
right. Is death the measurement? Is
right.
the oil infrastructure the measurement?
And as harsh as that is to even discuss, that's the reality of the situation. Is do we measure our involvement in humanitarian aid through deaths, or do we measure our involvement in humanitarian aid as in what are the long-term implications of doing it right now? So it's an emotional versus a stance on reason as to when we do it. When is the long term better?
Not even when, but how much.
How
to
much,
what organizations? Right. Are we going to combat starvation before we combat the economic plight? Are we going to build their infrastructure before we check out their energy sector?
Yeah.
Like, these are all very important questions to consider whenever you're considering sending humanitarian aid to someone.
Right, which is why when Greta mentioned that whole the climate change on economic,
go ahead.
when economic is more important than human lives, I'm like, it can be.
It's the same, though.
Right, it can be, and it's the same. Mm-hmm. Because people say, well, economics, and you care more about money. I'm like,
not necessarily.
Not necessarily. When we're talking about hegemony, like, for instance, the U.S. and hegemony, economic interest, let's put it this way. Hegemony can stabilize the international arena, in turn stabilize national security for pretty much every country in the world. So economic interest, money, plays into the fact of how we can play hegemony. If we don't have the money, the United States cannot remain.
Yeah, we can't play the game.
We can't play the game of hegemony. Therefore...
Right. And it's like, do you want the United States to control it, or do you want Russia or China to control it?
Or do you want Russia or China? Exactly.
Right,
And so when it's like...
There's no overarching authority in foreign relations.
So
and it's so annoying to hear people say something like, oh, well, NATO is the overarching authority. And it's kind of like, well, no, there are 5 countries in NATO that pretty much control everything. The United States, China, Russia, Germany, France, UK. That's 6.
Why do you think Poland wanted to contract the United States military out to defend Poland?
Exactly. It's like,
they didn't want to contract NATO. They wanted to contract the United States.
Things are not that simple, and NATO peacekeepers are not as good as the United States by itself. I'll tell you that right freaking now.
Or UN peacekeepers. Let's think Rwanda.
Right.
I'm just saying.
Only the biggest genocide in the last 2 decades.
It's
or more.
ridiculous. I mean, I think I don't even want to say my last words
Your
on this.
final thoughts?
Is that
Tommy Lauren?
It's just Tommy Lauren.
Oh.
Is it Lauren or Lauren?
Whatever.
Either
blonde.
Or. The blonde, whatever.
Final blonde.
She can't really defend herself when it comes to actual debate. Even though I think she is a smart cookie, if you will. But
Right.
she's never put up to anybody who actually differs from her views.
I know a lot of smart people that can't talk publicly.
Right.
But anyway.
But that's neither here nor there.
Yeah.
But I just my main issue with the whole, like, literally almost anything, and I hate to sound like this or very cynical, is that American society is so out of touch with the implications of any little thing.
Because we hate politics. You don't talk about politics or religion at the table.
Right, and that's partly been a big problem. That's why we are where we are.
One of the silliest rules in American culture, I think, actually exists.
Next to the whole snitches get stitches thing.
Right. Next to that.
Next to that. But the fact that American society is so detached from reality of implications of even just, well, it's just about money. Of course it is. We need money.
What else would it be about?
Money.
I hate to do that.
I hate it.
And
that's why I
don't like money either.
It's just about money.
But what is the other incentive that drives all human beings in common?
Money.
Nothing. Right? It's not like we're trading clothes or textiles for power. Like, as long as money exists, as long as gold and silver exists, as long as
and if you have another alternative,
like,
by all means. Is it Bitcoin? Bitcoin's already crossed Iran. Try again. I'm just saying. I'm just saying. So it's just ridiculous. Even the left, and the left is so focused on their, I'm more ethical than you or more moral than you, and the right is so into government is so evil, etc., etc., etc. No, you guys are the right is stuck on 1776. And
the left is stuck on 1619.
I was going to say, I don't know, whenever Marx and Hegel took over on emotional...
They're stuck in the 1880s,
how
obviously.
That was. And you just got to look at reality. For instance, when the right, a lot of my right-wingers say, we need limited government. I'm like, I agree. However, limited government, we cannot use 1776 as an example. First of all, the population is not as small as it was in 1776.
Well, I mean, if you just look at technology, just the method of communication from which we all kind of talk to each other, it's like what happens in Yemen today occurs in the United States tomorrow, and we're all very aware of that, I feel like.
I agree. So it's just a complicated issue that needs to be hashed out more just within society, in American society, or just anywhere, period. Yeah. And the classrooms, I think. I don't know.
So United States troops to Yemen, is this a good thing or a bad thing?
To Yemen?
Yeah. What is to Saudi Arabia? For Saudi Arabia's using, obviously.
I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing because somebody needs to step in, or at least provide aid to Saudi Arabia, and the fact that we give Saudi Arabia so much aid, and they're one of the biggest allies in that region.
Where's France and Germany in this? Where's the UK?
And that's where I was going to get to next. The UK, France, Germany, they all
agreed Iran, but none of them are doing anything.
But none of them sent anything. Who was that? Oh, only the hegemonic power in the United States of America. Hegemonic is not an actual word, by the way. Hegemony is. I just don't know how to use that when I'm talking about that tense.
I think hegemonic is fine.
It might be. Well, let's go with hegemonic.
We make up words.
Yeah, let's not make up words. But
semantics.
But the United States is on the top of that power of its hegemony, if you will. Is the hegemony. So I think the United States actually. It's a good thing that we stepped in because of that reason. We have to protect hegemony. And when I say
can't just allow the Middle East to fall into ruin.
Correct. And when I say protect hegemony, I'm not saying protect the United States. I'm saying protect the order.
Yeah, you're not a xenophobic nationalist.
Correct. I'm saying protect the order of the international arena. And for all you right-wingers and stuff like that, well, we don't want globalism, the world order, and the new world order.
Globalism's already here, friends.
You don't understand the new world order. Go read World Order by Henry Kissinger. Get an idea of that. Or End of History by Francis Fukuyama. Read that too. That Fukuyama fellow.
Francis Fukuyama.
But if you read all that, you will get an understanding of what exactly world order is. It's about, world order and globalism and internationalism is what I like to use.
The origin and decay of political power.
One example is the failure of the League of Nations. Of course, after World War II was the United Nations. I think anyway, the United States.
The League of Nations, World War I, failure.
Yeah, the failure of the League of Nations before World War II, after World War I. Yeah. Treaty of Versailles, go look into that. Mm-hmm. But I think the UN, we were forced to actually involve ourselves into the United States, or in the UN, I should say. And I will say.
Yeah, bringing it to the United States. It was the only solution.
It was
and
the only
United
solution.
States with the Marshall Plan kickstarted the rest of the European economy by rebuilding Germany. And it's like, you know, of course the United States would be the hegemonic power in this situation. But because of that, it puts us in precarious positions in which the United States public may not want to actually be privy to, but in which we have no other choice.
So until you can figure out how we're going to fix that power of, hey, we're the hegemony, or if you don't think we should be it, then tell me who. Because obviously Germany, the UK, and France did not want to step in when they're the ones who said Iran was the culprit, if you will. They did nothing. We had to step in. I mean,
what other solution is there?
You want Russia?
And if you don't have any solutions to the problem, you're just perpetuating complaint, which isn't actually any kind of like real solution to the problem.
And
right?
as president of the College Republicans, call me a neocon. I don't care.
Call me a neocon.
I don't care. That's just what I believe.
All right, Ray, it was awesome.
Likewise.
This is awesome.
Touche.
All right, you have a great day. It was nice talking to you.
All right, back to some football here. Sunday night football in a little bit.
Yay, 49ers.
No, they're not playing today.
49ers.
We're not playing today. Not today.
Okay.
Bye week. It's all right.
Bye week. My bad.
It's Cowboys and the Saints.
Oh, I like the Saints. When they were breaking legs for money?
Yeah.
I swear I'm not a capitalist. All right. Ray, nice talking to you. Love you, man.
Touche. Likewise.